I want him left with absolutely nothing before Monday morning.
The 2-carat diamond ring hit the impeccably tailored fabric of Declan Cross's thigh with a dull, heavy thud before rolling onto the plush floorboard of the moving limousine. I want him entirely ruined, stripped of every last cent, and begging on his knees before the market opens on Monday morning, Nora Sterling said, her voice completely devoid of the hysterical tears one might expect from a woman who had just been brutally discarded by her husband of 5 years. Rain lashed violently against the tinted windows of the Maybach as it glided through the neon-lit streets of Manhattan, casting fragmented, chaotic shadows across the sharp planes of Declan's face. He did not immediately reach for the discarded jewelry, nor did he offer a shred of pity to the soaked, shivering woman sitting across from him, whose expensive trench coat was ruined by the torrential downpour outside the Plaza Hotel. You break into my private car, interrupt my conference call, and throw Julian's garbage at my lap, expecting me to act as your personal executioner? Declan murmured, his tone a lethal combination of boredom and dark amusement, as his piercing gray eyes methodically assessed her ruined state. Give me one logical reason why the CEO of Cross Capital should care about the domestic squabbles of a rival who barely registers as a threat on my radar, Mrs. Sterling. Because Julian didn't just file for divorce tonight. He executed a corporate restructuring that locked me out of the very trusts I helped him build, leaving me with absolutely nothing. Nora fired back, refusing to flinch under his predatory gaze as she leaned forward, her wet hair clinging to her pale cheeks. She knew exactly who Declan Cross was, a ruthless, emotionally barren apex predator of Wall Street who had been locked in a vicious, silent war with Julian for the past 3 years. He thinks he can replace me with the Sterling heiress to secure the European expansion, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire is built on a foundation of sand. Declan arched a dark eyebrow, his large hand finally picking up the diamond ring and rolling it thoughtfully between his long fingers, treating the symbol of her broken marriage like a cheap trinket. It sounds like a tragic tale of a naive trophy wife who trusted the wrong snake, Nora. But my business is hostile takeovers, not charity work for scorned women looking for a quick payout, he stated coldly, tossing the ring into the crystal cup holder beside him. If you came here looking for a knight in shining armor to fight your battles, you have severely misjudged both my character and my schedule. I don't need a knight, Declan. I need a monster, and you are the most terrifying one in this city, she replied, without a single heartbeat of hesitation, the absolute conviction in her voice making him pause. For the first time since she had forced her way into his vehicle, Declan truly looked at her, seeing past the smeared mascara and the trembling hands to the fierce, unyielding inferno burning within her dark brown eyes. He had always dismissed Nora as just another pretty accessory on Julian's arm, a quiet woman who smiled politely at charity galas while her husband stole the spotlight. But the creature sitting before him now was feral, dangerous, and practically vibrating with a thirst for vengeance. He took everything from me, erased my contributions, and threw me out into the rain with a taxi fare, thinking I would just quietly disappear into obscurity, she whispered, her voice dropping to a lethal, razor-sharp register. I know the structural weaknesses of his entire European portfolio, Declan, and if you give me the resources, I will hand you his head on a silver platter. Declan let out a low, humorless laugh, leaning back against the leather seat as he opened the glowing screen of his laptop. entirely unconvinced by the desperate bravado of a woman who had never worked a day on the trading floor. "You speak with a lot of fire, Nora, but corporate espionage requires a level of tactical genius that cannot be fueled by mere anger," he said dismissively, his eyes scanning a highly classified, heavily encrypted algorithm matrix that his top quants had been struggling to stabilize for weeks. Nora's eyes darted to the glowing screen, tracking the cascading lines of financial code and risk assessment variables that were meant to predict market volatility for a massive upcoming merger. "Your baseline volatility index is fundamentally flawed because your quants are using a linear regression model for a market that is currently experiencing exponential, unpredictable shifts due to the offshore tariff rumors," she stated casually, her gaze locking onto his shocked expression. "If you execute that trade tomorrow morning, you won't stabilize the merger. You will trigger a cascading liquidity crisis and bleed $400 million before lunch." The oppressive silence that instantly filled the limousine was heavy thick, with a sudden, staggering realization as Declan stared at the code, then back at the woman who had just effortlessly dismantled a multi-million-dollar algorithm in 3 seconds. The air pressure inside the vehicle seemed to shift dramatically, the dismissive arrogance evaporating from Declan's demeanor as he slowly closed the laptop, a new, intense, predatory interest taking its place. "Who exactly are you, Nora?" he demanded, his voice stripped of all sarcasm, echoing the profound shock of a man who had just stumbled upon a hidden gold mine in the middle of a junkyard. She lifted her chin, the remnants of the quiet, obedient wife completely disintegrating, to reveal the brilliant, calculating strategist who had been forced into the shadows for half a decade. "I am the ghostwriter of every successful algorithm Julian has ever pitched to his board, the silent architect of his entire meteoric rise, and the only reason his company hasn't collapsed under the weight of his own profound incompetence." She confessed the bitter truth, tasting like ash and iron on her tongue. "He took the credit, he took the glory, and tonight, when I finally demanded my rightful equity, he took my entire life." Declan studied her with a chilling, clinical fascination, his brilliant mind instantly calculating the devastating potential of the weapon that had just dropped itself into his lap. "If what you are saying is true, and I will verify every single word of it, then Julian hasn't just made a mistake. He has handed me the nuclear codes to his entire existence." Declan murmured a dangerous, thrilling smile, slowly curling the edges of his mouth. He leaned forward, closing the physical distance between them, until she could smell the intoxicating blend of vetiver, expensive scotch, and raw power that radiated from his skin. "I will give you the capital, the legal protection, and the platform to tear him apart piece by piece. But in exchange, you are going to work exclusively for me, and we are going to do this my way." Nora didn't shrink back from his imposing proximity. Instead, she met his intense gaze head-on, her heart hammering a frantic, exhilarating rhythm against her ribs as she realized she was making a deal with the devil himself. "What exactly does your way entail, Declan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging furiously through her veins. "It entails a public, highly publicized, and utterly scandalous fake engagement between the two of us, starting tomorrow," he declared, his eyes flashing with ruthless corporate strategy. "A fake engagement?" Nora gasped, the sheer absurdity of the proposition momentarily breaking through her icy facade as she stared at the most notoriously guarded, emotionally unavailable bachelor in New York. A scandalous romance between Julian's discarded wife and his greatest rival will dominate the financial news cycle causing a media frenzy that will instantly destabilize his investor confidence and tank his stock price before the European merger can even close. Declan explained with chilling efficiency, outlining the destruction of a man's life as easily as ordering a cup of coffee. While the press is busy obsessing over our sudden, passionate love affair, you will be operating from the shadows of my penthouse, using my servers to dismantle his algorithms and execute the hostile takeover. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a blank legal pad and a silver fountain pen. His demeanor strictly business, despite the wildly intimate nature of his proposal. We will call it the Phoenix Protocol, a mutually beneficial arrangement with strict boundaries. No emotional attachments, no genuine romantic feelings, and the moment Julian's empire is ashes, we dissolve the contract and walk away. Nora looked at the pen extended toward her, the silver metal catching the dim light of the limousine, representing a complete point of no return. It was a cold, transactional agreement designed to weaponize human emotion, a calculated game of deception that required her to step into the blinding spotlight alongside a man who viewed love as a liability. Yet, as she thought of Julian's smug face of the years she had spent shrinking herself to fit into his suffocating shadow, the fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. No emotional attachments, purely professional destruction. Nora confirmed, taking the heavy silver pen from his fingers, their skin brushing for a fraction of a second, sending an unexpected, treacherous spark of electricity up her arm. She signed her name at the bottom of the makeshift contract with swift, aggressive strokes, officially binding herself to the most dangerous predator on Wall Street. Declan took the pad back, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a promise of absolute, unmitigated chaos. "Welcome to Cross Capital, my dear fake fiancé," he whispered into the shadows. "Let's go burn your husband's world to the ground." The transformation of Nora Sterling began at 6 a.m. the following morning, led by a team of stylists and image consultants who descended upon her borrowed suite at the St. Regis like an elite tactical unit. Declan had not spared a single cent, ensuring that every garment, every accessory, and every piece of jewelry was carefully curated to project the image of a woman who was not only surviving a scandalous divorce, but thriving in the arms of one of the world's most powerful billionaires. As they pinned a custom-made emerald silk gown to her frame, Nora caught a glimpse of herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror and barely recognized the cold, sophisticated creature staring back. Gone was the woman who had spent 5 years dressing for her husband's approval, replaced by someone with a razor-sharp jawline, cold, calculating eyes, and a wardrobe that screamed old money power. When she finally stepped into the foyer of the penthouse, Declan was waiting, looking impossibly imposing, in a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit his athletic frame like armor. His gray eyes scanning her with the same clinical detachment he might use to appraise a stock acquisition. "Acceptable," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum, lacking any ounce of genuine warmth as he checked his watch. "The press conference is in 40 minutes. Try to look like you're actually enjoying being my fiancée, Nora, because if you falter, Julian's public relations team will tear us to shreds." They stepped into the back of a blacked-out SUV, the interior suffocatingly intimate as Declan immediately pulled out his tablet to review the day's market volatility. Nora sat on the edge of her seat, her pulse racing with a mix of adrenaline and genuine terror as she realized the sheer scale of the lie they were about to perform before the entire world. "We need a history," Declan said without looking up from his screen, his fingers dancing across the interface as he adjusted the projected stock price for Julian's company. "They will ask how we met, the nature of the timeline, and why you left him so suddenly." My PR team has drafted a narrative of a long-standing, intense professional rivalry that blossomed into a deep, secret connection over the past 6 months. But we need to improvise the details to make it human, to make it stick. He turned his piercing gaze to her, his expression suddenly intense, a mask of calculated intent. "Think of a moment, Nora, one that sounds real, one that sounds like the breaking point. If we don't have a shared memory that resonates with emotion, the press will smell the rot in this story." Nora's mind raced, searching for a memory that felt authentic, yet fit the narrative, her heart hammering against her ribs as she felt the weight of their deception pressing in on her. 6 months ago, at the International Finance Summit in Zurich, he humiliated me in front of the board by suggesting I didn't understand the basic principles of macroeconomics, and I ended up taking a walk alone through the snow near the hotel, she said, the raw bitterness of the memory still sharp and vivid. "You were there, Declan. I bumped into you at a cafe where you were nursing a black coffee, looking just as bored and irritated as I was, and we talked for 3 hours about the absurdity of our lives." Declan held her gaze, a small, genuine spark of curiosity flickering in his usually cold eyes as he processed her improvised story. "That works," he whispered, a hint of genuine, unpracticed amusement touching his lips as he reached over, his large hand brushing against hers, his fingers lacing through hers in a way that felt entirely too real for their agreement. "Let's stick to Zurich then. It's cold, it's dramatic, and it sounds like the beginning of an obsession." The press conference was a nightmare of blinding camera flashes and aggressive, invasive questioning that hammered at Nora's defenses from every conceivable angle. As they walked onto the stage, Declan held her hand with a possessive iron grip, his other arm resting firmly at the small of her back, a gesture of intimacy that sent involuntary shivers down her spine. "Mr. Cross, is it true that you and Mrs. Sterling have been seeing each other since before the divorce was finalized?" A reporter from the Financial Times barked, his voice loud enough to cut through the din of the room. Declan didn't hesitate, his smile dazzling, charming, and utterly fake as he pulled Nora closer, pressing a lingering, deliberate kiss to her shoulder for the cameras. "Zurich was the beginning, but it took us a long time to realize what was right in front of us," he replied, his voice smooth as silk, projecting enough confidence to silence the immediate room. "When you find something this real, this important, you don't worry about the noise, you just protect it." The room gasped, the collective reaction, a ripple of shock that felt like a success. But for Nora, the act felt dangerously, intoxicatingly authentic. "And how does Julian feel about his greatest rival taking his wife?" Another reporter yelled his question, clearly intended to incite a reaction that would drive the headlines. Nora leaned forward into the microphone, her face a carefully crafted mask of serene defiance, her voice cold and resonant. "Julian Sterling is interested in acquisitions, not people, and he has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the arrangement we are announcing today," she stated, her words landing like a hammer blow in the room. "This isn't about him. It's about the fact that I've finally found someone who understands the true value of an equal partnership." She looked at Declan, and for a fraction of a second, the performance seemed to blur, the electric current between them feeling far too powerful to be purely for the public's benefit. Declan squeezed her hand, his expression intense, a flicker of something raw and unprotected passing through his gray eyes, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that the public was not the only one being deceived by their flawless fiction. As they exited the building, the storm of cameras following them to the SUV, Nora felt the weight of her choice, the thrill of the hunt, and the confusing, frightening reality of playing a game where the lines were blurring. "You were perfect," Declan murmured as the SUV pulled away, his voice now devoid of the performance, his hand still lingering on hers. "You sounded like you meant every word of that bit about an equal partnership." Nora turned to look out the window, her pulse still racing, the heat from his touch still radiating through her skin. "I was just delivering the lines you gave me, Declan," she replied, her voice slightly strained as she tried to reestablish the necessary professional distance. "And I would advise you not to get confused by your own script, because the moment the share price of Julian's company hits the floor, this entire charade ends." Declan leaned back, his eyes closing, a mask of cool detachment settling over his face once more. But his fingers still toyed with the fabric of her sleeve. "Don't worry, Nora. I have no intention of forgetting the terms of our arrangement," he said, his voice flat, but the subtle tremor in his hand betrayed the composure he was fighting to maintain. That evening, the first effects of their announcement began to ripple through the market, with Julian's company's stock opening at a frantic, jagged decline. They sat in the penthouse study, the room illuminated only by the soft glow of the monitors displaying the data flows and the real-time fallout of their public relations disaster. Nora worked with a savage, focused intensity, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she systematically began to dismantle the security protocols surrounding Julian's most prized algorithm. Declan watched her from the doorway, his eyes dark, with a mix of fascination and caution, realizing that he had underestimated her brilliance at every single turn. "You're targeting the integrity of the data stream directly," he noted, his voice low as he stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the complex lines of code she was weaving into Julian's system. "If he detects this, he'll lock down the entire network and we'll lose our window to finalize the takeover." Nora didn't look up, her concentration absolute, her face illuminated by the blue light of the screens. "He won't detect it because I'm using his own administrative override credentials, the ones he forgot to change after our last audit," she whispered, a small, cold smile on her lips. "He thinks he's the smartest man in the room, Declan, but he was never the one doing the work," she continued, her voice filled with a quiet, lethal satisfaction as she executed a series of commands that began to drain Julian's offshore liquidity reserves into a blind account. The room was deathly silent, the only sound the soft hum of the servers as they watched the numbers on the screen turn a violent, crashing red. It was a masterpiece of financial destruction, the culmination of years of quiet, invisible labor that was finally being turned into a weapon of war. Declan walked over, standing behind her, his presence a dark, powerful shadow, his hands resting on the back of her chair as he watched the destruction unfold. "You're not just breaking him, Nora. You're erasing him," he murmured, his voice laced with a newfound, dangerous level of respect. "I like it." The air between them was thick, heavy with the scent of success, the thrill of the hunt, and a sudden, unwelcome heat that had nothing to do with the electronics. Nora felt his breath against her neck, the warmth of his proximity a constant, seductive reminder of the game they were playing. "He deserves to be erased, Declan," she whispered, her heart pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm as she felt him lean closer, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. his fingers pressing lightly against the fabric of her dress. She could feel the vibration of his voice in the air, the sheer, intoxicating power of being the architect of Julian's ruin. "I'm not doing this for you, and I'm not doing this for the company. I'm doing this for me," she added, her voice strong and unwavering, a declaration of her own sovereignty in the middle of their shared destruction. Declan didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned further in, his face inches from hers, his eyes dark, searching, hungry. "I know who you're doing this for, Nora," he breathed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made her breath hitch. "And that makes this far more interesting than I ever anticipated." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the cold, clinical focus replaced by a raw, predatory tension that was entirely personal. They were two monsters in a gilded cage, tearing down a shared enemy while slowly, inevitably, recognizing the same dangerous, burning hunger in each other. The clock on the wall of Declan's sprawling penthouse study chimed 3 a.m., its hollow, metallic echo doing absolutely nothing to break the suffocating electric tension that had settled over the room. Nora sat cross-legged in a massive leather armchair, her eyes glued to the glowing dual monitors as her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with the terrifying precision of a sniper. The air was thick with the scent of stale espresso burning ambition and the faint, woodsy trace of Declan's cologne, which seemed to wrap around her like a heavy, invisible blanket. Across the sprawling mahogany desk, Declan was supposedly reviewing the Asian market indices, but his sharp gray eyes kept drifting over the top of his tablet, utterly captivated by the woman who was currently disemboweling his greatest rival's digital infrastructure. Julian's secondary firewalls are laughably archaic. He hasn't updated his encryption protocols since he locked me out of the main server 2 years ago. Nora muttered a dark, victorious smirk playing on her lips as she bypassed another layer of security without breaking a sweat. Declan leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, profoundly fascinated by the feral grace with which she operated in the digital shadows. She wasn't just a scorned wife seeking petty revenge. She was an apex predator, finally unleashed into her natural habitat. The exhaustion of the past 48 hours was beginning to bleed into Nora's bones, but the pure, unadulterated thrill of the hunt kept her adrenaline spiking dangerously high. She rubbed her tired eyes, momentarily looking away from the cascading green code, and found Declan watching her with an intensity that made the breath catch sharply in her throat. "Take a break, Nora, before you burn yourself out before the market even opens," he commanded softly, standing up and closing the distance between them to place a fresh, steaming mug of black coffee on the desk right next to her hand. The casual intimacy of the gesture, paired with the sheer physical magnetism of his imposing frame, sent a treacherous shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the cool temperature of the penthouse. "I can't stop now, Declan. I just isolated the predictive routing model he uses for his offshore accounts, and I need to map the logic sequence before his system runs its daily diagnostic," she argued, pulling a handwritten legal pad toward her to jot down a complex string of variables. Declan didn't retreat to his side of the room. Instead, he stepped behind her chair, his broad chest mere inches from her back, his gaze dropping to the frantic, elegant shorthand she was scribbling on the yellow paper. "Let me see that routing model," he said, his voice dropping an octave, the sudden proximity making it entirely impossible for her to focus on the numbers. Nora handed him the legal pad over her shoulder, her skin accidentally brushing against his warm knuckles, a brief point of contact that sparked like a live wire in the quiet, dim room. Declan took the pad, his eyes scanning her messy, frantic equations, analyzing the unique structural logic she used to bypass Julian's algorithmic safeguards. As he read the specific, highly unconventional syntax she utilized to loop the command protocols, the air in his lungs completely evaporated, leaving him frozen in a state of absolute, staggering disbelief. He had seen this exact structural anomaly before, 4 years ago, buried deep within the source code of the revolutionary high-frequency trading platform that had catapulted Julian Sterling from a mid-level manager to a Wall Street titan overnight. The asynchronous data looping the recursive variables embedded in the latency caps, Declan murmured, his voice sounding hollow, distant, as he stared at the yellow paper like it was a sacred ancient artifact. He slowly lowered the pad, his gray eyes locking onto the back of Nora's head with a terrifying, awestruck intensity. It wasn't Julian who engineered the 2021 market sweep. It was never Julian, was it? He demanded the pieces of a massive, infuriating puzzle, finally snapping into perfect, undeniable clarity. Nora's fingers stopped dead on the keyboard, her entire body going rigid as the ghost of her greatest, most painful secret was suddenly dragged into the cold, harsh light of the present. She slowly turned her chair to face him, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs, as she looked into the eyes of a man who had just dismantled her final layer of defense. Julian couldn't code his way out of a paper bag if his life depended on it, she confessed, the bitter, jagged truth tasting like iron on her tongue, her brown eyes blazing with a mixture of shame and fierce defiance. I wrote the 2021 platform in our tiny studio apartment while he was out networking, and when it succeeded, he convinced me that Wall Street wouldn't trust a woman behind the curtain, so I let him be the face of my genius. Declan stared at her, the sheer magnitude of Julian's theft and Nora's sacrificed brilliance hitting him with the force of a physical blow. For years, Declan had hunted the elusive phantom coder who had revolutionized the market, offering blank checks and unlimited resources to anyone who could unmask the genius, only to discover that the genius had been trapped in a gilded cage right across the street. He didn't just steal your work, Nora. He buried you alive because he was terrified that the world would realize he was nothing but an empty suit riding on the coattails of a goddamn savant. Declan whispered, his voice vibrating with a cold, lethal fury directed entirely at Julian. The validation, the absolute unwavering recognition in Declan's eyes, stripped away the last remnants of Nora's professional armor, leaving her feeling dangerously exposed and overwhelmingly seen. No one had ever looked at her like this, not with pity for the discarded wife, but with a profound, almost reverent awe for the brilliant architect she truly was. He told me I was too emotional to handle the pressure of the board, that my place was to support him, to be the quiet, smiling foundation of his empire, she said, her voice shaking slightly as the years of gaslighting and emotional manipulation bubbled to the surface. Declan tossed the legal pad onto the desk, his jaw clenching as he took a deliberate step toward her, the space between them shrinking until there was nowhere left for her to hide. Julian is a pathetic, insecure coward who couldn't handle the fact that he was married to a woman who possessed 10 times his intellect and 100 times his strength. Declan declared, his voice a low, rough rasp that vibrated in the tight space between them. He reached out his large, warm hands, gently gripping her shoulders, pulling her slightly out of the chair until she was standing inches away from his imposing frame. "You are not a ghost, Nora. and you are certainly not a foundation for lesser men to stand on. You are a queen, and it is about time you burned his pathetic little kingdom to the ground. The intensity of his gaze, the heat radiating from his hands, and the intoxicating truth of his words shattered the clinical, transactional nature of their agreement entirely. Nora looked up into his striking gray eyes, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the predatory hunger that had replaced his usual calculated detachment. He wasn't looking at a business partner. He was looking at a woman he desperately, wildly wanted to consume. Slowly, inevitably, Declan lowered his head, giving her a fraction of a second to step away, but the magnetic pull between them was a gravitational force she simply could not fight. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a hesitant, questioning kiss. It was an explosion of raw, pent-up desire, a fierce, demanding claim that sent a blinding shockwave of electricity through her entire nervous system. Nora let out a soft, breathless gasp, her hands instinctively flying up to grip the lapels of his crisp shirt, anchoring herself as he pulled her flush against his hard, muscular chest. He kissed her with the starving desperation of a man who had finally found the one thing he had been searching for his entire life. His tongue sweeping past her lips to taste the dark, addictive fire that burned within her. For a long, dizzying moment, Nora surrendered entirely to the overwhelming tide of sensation, kissing him back with a fierce, hungry urgency that matched his own. Her fingers tangled in his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer as the sterile penthouse office dissolved around them, leaving only the heat of his skin and the intoxicating taste of his mouth. Declan groaned low in his throat, his hands sliding down her back to grip her waist, lifting her slightly off her feet as he devoured her, the kiss deepening into something dangerously possessive and wildly out of control. It was perfect. It was everything she had secretly, terrifyingly craved since the moment she had thrown that diamond ring into his lap. But as his large hand moved to cup the back of her neck, his thumb stroking her jawline with a gesture of blatant ownership, a sudden, violent spike of panic pierced through the haze of her desire. The familiar feeling of being engulfed, of surrendering her power to a dominant, wealthy man who could destroy her life with a single signature, triggered a visceral, traumatic reflex she couldn't suppress. With a sharp, sudden gasp, Nora shoved her hands against his chest, breaking the kiss and stumbling backward, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. "Stop," Nora choked out, her chest heaving as she pressed her back against the edge of the mahogany desk, her eyes wide with a wild, cornered panic. Declan froze, his breathing heavy and ragged, his dark hair disheveled, looking at her with a mixture of intense frustration and immediate, razor-sharp concern. He took a half step forward, his hand instinctively reaching out to comfort her. But she held up a trembling palm, a clear, desperate barrier between them. "Don't, Declan, just don't," she whispered, her voice cracking as the crushing weight of her vulnerabilities slammed back into place, fortifying the walls he had just managed to breach. "I spent 5 years letting a powerful man make me believe I needed him to validate my existence, and I will not survive making that exact same mistake twice." She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold reality of their situation extinguishing the fiery passion of the moment with brutal efficiency. "We have a contract, Declan. The Phoenix Protocol strictly forbids emotional attachments, and I need you to remember that I am here to execute a hostile takeover, not to become your next acquisition." Declan let his hand drop to his side, the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes slowly retreating behind the impenetrable, icy mask of the ruthless CEO she had met in the limousine. The rejection stung a sharp, unfamiliar ache in his chest, but his brilliant mind instantly understood the profound, paralyzing fear that was driving her retreat. She wasn't rejecting him. She was protecting the fragile sovereignty she had just begun to reclaim. "You are right, Nora," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the heat and reverence that had consumed him just moments before, officially re-establishing the professional chasm between them. It was a lapse in judgment, a momentary distraction fueled by exhaustion and adrenaline, and I assure you, it will not happen again. He turned his back to her, walking over to the window to stare out at the glittering, indifferent lights of the Manhattan skyline, his posture rigid and tense. "Focus on the offshore routing models. Julian will undoubtedly notice the liquidity drain by tomorrow afternoon, and we need to be ready to drop the hammer." Nora stared at his broad back, her lips still tingling from the ghost of his kiss, feeling a profound hollow ache settle deep in her gut as she turned back to the glowing monitors, realizing that keeping her heart safe might just be the most painful choice she had ever made. The morning light filtering into the study felt clinical and unforgiving, highlighting the dark circles under Declan's eyes and the jagged, restless energy vibrating through the room. Julian Sterling had been erratic for days, sensing the systemic decay of his empire, but unable to locate the source. His panicked attempts at recovery only serving to trigger further market instability. Nora sat at the console, her face an impassive mask of cold efficiency, as she watched Julian's primary server attempt to reroute the diverted liquidity back into the main accounts. It was a desperate amateur move. He thinks he can force a manual override without triggering the SEC alerts, but he's forgotten that I designed the very threshold triggers he's currently tripping, she murmured, her voice steady as she began the final phase of the protocol. Declan stood over her, his presence a silent, looming force, watching the digital slaughter with a mixture of predatory satisfaction and a haunting, lingering ache from their interrupted moment in the office. The liquidity crisis is hemorrhaging his portfolio at a rate of $50 million per hour. Declan observed, his voice low, lacking its usual bite as he watched the catastrophic red lines on the graph. The board is already calling for an emergency session. He's officially lost the majority support of the shareholders. The tension in the penthouse was shattered by a frantic, high-priority alert that pulsed across the primary display, a direct, encrypted line opening from Julian Sterling himself. Nora hesitated, her hand hovering over the accept button before glancing up at Declan, who simply gave a sharp, imperceptible nod. She connected the call. Julian's face appeared on the large monitor, looking disheveled and wild-eyed, his usual polished veneer of arrogant entitlement replaced by the crumbling terror of a man watching his life's work dissolve into nothingness. "I know it's you," Julian snarled, his voice a distorted, trembling rasp as he stared at the screen, not realizing Nora was the one controlling the interface. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, Declan, but I've already triggered the emergency legal protocol. I'm filing for immediate bankruptcy protection, and I will drag you down into the muck with me." Nora remained silent, her hands motionless on the desk, letting the sheer absurdity of his desperation echo in the room, while Declan stepped forward, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen as he leaned into the microphone. "You're not filing for bankruptcy, Julian. You're filing for liquidation, and you're not dragging anyone anywhere except into a very long, very public prison sentence," Declan said, his voice cold, calm, and absolutely lethal. "And just so you know exactly who is holding the knife," Nora interjected, her voice cutting through the static with a clarity that made Julian freeze in his chair. "I'm the one who wrote the algorithms that built your fortune. I'm the one who maintained your security for 5 years. And I am the one who just liquidated your final offshore account." Julian stared at the screen, his mouth agape, his face turning an ashen, sickly shade of white as the realization finally crushed him. The woman he had treated as a subservient accessory for years had not only been the architect of his rise, but was now, with chilling surgical precision, orchestrating his total annihilation. "Nora," he whispered, his voice cracking the arrogance, replaced by a pathetic, cowering disbelief. You wouldn't." "I already did," she replied, her voice devoid of any lingering emotion as she pressed the final command key on her keyboard, sealing the transfer of his assets and officially triggering the regulatory audit that would dismantle his remaining reputation. The connection cut out, the screen going black, and the absolute silence that returned to the penthouse felt like the final breath of a dying era. Julian was finished. He was a man without a kingdom, without a future, and without a legacy. Declan turned to Nora, the fury and the hunger in his eyes, replaced by a profound, disorienting sense of awe as he realized the sheer scale of the power she had just exerted. He walked over to where she sat, his movements slow and deliberate, the professional distance they had been trying so desperately to maintain, dissolving in the face of their absolute, undeniable victory. "You just achieved in 48 hours what I have been trying to accomplish for 3 years, he said, his voice raw, his hands resting on the armrests of her chair, his body crowding her, in the scent of him and the intoxicating energy of the moment making her head spin. "You didn't just win, Nora, you revolutionized the entire market with that protocol." She looked up at him, the adrenaline beginning to crash, leaving her feeling exposed and overwhelmingly vulnerable. The destruction was complete. The enemy was neutralized, and the contract, according to their terms, was supposed to end right here. Yet, as she looked at Declan, she felt the terrifying electric pull of a future that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the man standing before her. "It's over," she whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of triumph and a sudden, sharp, aching sense of loss. "The protocol is complete. We're done." Declan shook his head, his hand sliding from the chair to cup her face, his touch firm, warm, and utterly inescapable. "The protocol was designed for Julian, but you are not Julian, and I am not the man I was 48 hours ago," he declared, his gaze locking onto hers with a desperate, hungry intensity. "We are not done, Nora. We have barely even begun." He lowered his head, his lips grazing hers, a soft, testing touch that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies and a promise of something far more enduring than their transactional agreement. When their lips met, the explosive, consuming fire they had shared in the study returned. But this time it was tempered with a deep, searing realization that they were no longer fighting a war against an enemy, but finally beginning to navigate the unpredictable, dangerous territory of a genuine connection. It was a kiss that didn't demand ownership or control. It was a kiss that sought alliance, forgiveness, and a future built on equal ground. Nora melted against him, the walls she had spent years building, finally crumbling into dust, as she realized that in the midst of the destruction of her old life, she had found the one thing she never thought she would have the right to possess, a partner who actually truly saw her. The euphoria of the moment was interrupted by a sharp, urgent ping on Declan's secure terminal, a notification from his legal team regarding the immediate filing of the liquidation papers and the start of the regulatory proceedings. The business of destruction was still moving, but the personal, devastatingly real atmosphere in the room made the paperwork feel like a relic of a past life. Declan pulled back his eyes, dark with regret, as he looked at the screen, then back at Nora, his hands lingering on her cheeks for one final lingering second before he stepped back to restore the necessary order. The board is going to descend on the office in an hour to confirm the takeover, he said, his voice once again composed, professional, but his gaze remained fixed on her with an intensity that burned. You need to be there, Nora, not as my fiancé, but as the primary architect of the most sophisticated financial operation of the decade. He moved to the side, giving her space, but his presence remained a powerful anchor in the room. The world is about to see who was actually running Sterling Holdings, and I want them to know exactly who they are dealing with. Nora stood up, her legs feeling shaky, but her spirit feeling more powerful than she had ever felt in her life. She was no longer a shadow, she was the architect. The fallout of Julian Sterling's downfall was a spectacle that dominated the financial headlines for weeks, a masterclass in calculated corporate demolition that left the industry reeling. Nora Sterling, now publicly revealed as the silent architect behind Sterling Holdings' most innovative successes, stepped out of the boardroom of Cross Capital with an air of absolute, unassailable authority. The suit she wore was no longer a costume for a public performance. It was a garment of power, tailored to her own stature, reflecting the woman who had not just survived the storm, but had steered it. As she emerged into the bustling lobby, the cameras and microphones were there, but the predatory, condescending glint in the reporter's eyes had been replaced by a cautious, fearful respect. She didn't look at them as she walked past, her gaze fixed on the doors leading to the freedom of the city. She was done playing the role of the quiet wife or the vengeful ex. She was Nora Sterling, and for the first time, the future was entirely hers to command. Declan followed her out, his presence a dark, immovable force. But he didn't attempt to lead, nor did he try to overshadow her. He stood back, watching with a look of profound, grounding pride as she navigated the media storm, realizing that the woman he had once seen as a tool for revenge had become the only person in the world who could truly stand beside him. The liquidation is finalized, he murmured when they were finally settled in the back of the private SUV. The silence inside, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. And I've made sure that Julian will never have the capital to even consider a comeback. He is officially permanently erased. Nora leaned back against the leather seat, the adrenaline finally fading into a deep, satisfying sense of peace that washed over her like the tide. She looked at him, not with the calculating gaze of an operative, but with the clear, honest eyes of a partner who had fought through the fire and emerged whole. He wasn't the only one we erased, Declan, she said softly, her voice steady. We also erased the rules that kept us from being who we really are. Declan turned to look at her, the mask of the ruthless CEO having long since dissolved, leaving behind a man who looked remarkably, terrifyingly vulnerable. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the original, handwritten contract they had signed in the back of that limousine, the Phoenix Protocol that had dictated their every move for the past month. With a deliberate, measured movement, he ripped the document into pieces, the sound a quiet final closing of the chapter that had bound them together in deceit. "The contract is void," he declared, his voice rough with a depth of emotion he no longer felt the need to hide. He reached out his hand, finding hers, his fingers lacing through hers in a way that felt entirely, irrevocably natural. "I don't want a partner in vengeance anymore, Nora. I want a partner in life, someone who will challenge me, someone who will stand with me when the world is burning, and someone who will build a legacy that is actually worth something." The declaration hung in the air, a simple, powerful promise that carried more weight than any of the legal documents they had spent weeks perfecting. Nora felt the tension that had been her constant companion since the night of the divorce finally release, replaced by a surge of warmth and potential. She had spent years trying to fit into a life that demanded she be smaller, quieter, and less intelligent. But with Declan, she felt the exhilarating freedom of being entirely, unapologetically herself. She didn't need to ask if he meant it. She saw the transformation in his demeanor, the way he had dismantled his own defenses, the way he looked at her, not as an acquisition, but as an equal. "I spent so long believing that power was about control, about who could inflict the most damage," she confessed, her voice thick with realization. "But I think, perhaps, true power is having the courage to stop fighting and start building." Declan smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made his entire face look lighter, younger, and entirely relieved. "Then let's build," he said, his thumb tracing the back of her hand, a small, intimate gesture of absolute devotion. "Let's build a life that isn't built on someone else's destruction." The months that followed were a revelation, a quiet, steady rhythm of building a partnership that was the envy of the entire financial world. They didn't retreat into the shadows. Instead, they emerged as a power couple, but one whose influence was built on intelligence, collaboration, and a shared, unbreakable commitment. Nora launched her own investment firm, focusing on supporting tech startups founded by women and underrepresented innovators, proving that her vision was far more than just a weapon for corporate war. Declan, in turn, found that his empire thrived with her insights and her stabilizing presence, and for the first time, he found he could leave the office without feeling the crushing weight of solitude waiting for him in his penthouse. They didn't need a contract to govern their lives, their love, or their work. They had found a rhythm that was entirely, perfectly their own. One evening, after a particularly successful board meeting, they sat on the terrace of their shared home, looking out over the city that had been the backdrop for their chaotic, beautiful story. "Who would have thought," Nora whispered, leaning her head against Declan's shoulder as the city lights began to twinkle to life below, "that a broken diamond ring and a rain-soaked limousine would lead us here?" Declan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, the gesture a silent, unbreakable promise of all the days they had ahead of them. "I don't think it was the ring or the car, Nora," he murmured into her hair, his voice low and full of an emotion that was profound and bottomless. "I think it was always going to be us, no matter how many rules we tried to build to keep us apart." He kissed her then, a slow, sweet promise in the quiet air of the evening. Their story had started with a desperate plea for destruction and a cold contract built on lies, but it had ended with a truth they had forged from the ashes of everything they used to be. It was their happily ever after, not because they were perfect, but because they had chosen to break their own rules for something far more important: each other. And it was only the first chapter.